All right, Khayelihle Khumalo, my colleague, joins us now in the studio to talk a little bit more about this. So, what sparked this meeting, Khayelihle? I know the International Relations Minister spoke about the AU's, what she says was unilateral decision to grant Israel observer mission status, but surely that singular incident could not have led to this.
Well, that's right, SABC. But of course, I mean, quite a number of reasons attributed to this. A very great deal of concern from the side of Palestinians. So they say the continent really is really facing a myriad of challenges. But in terms of their very consistent support, you'd recall that, you go to the AU summit, without fail, the Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, will always be there to talk about, their quest for self-determination. So they feel that the continent is really stepping away. So I suppose the massive trigger was that particular moment where the AU Commission Chair, Mr. Faki Mohammed, decided to unilaterally grant that observer status to the state of Israel, in fact. And Minister Pandor says obviously quite a number of factors, a number of vulnerable economies in Africa. This could be just pushed by, the issues around the Israelis trying to use their economic prowess to entice the African nations really to coerce Mr. Mohammed to have this particular decision made. But at this particular point in time, that move was deferred to the next AU summit. So hence now the Palestinians are saying, we're counting on you, Africa, and quite a very symbolic, really, gesture having this particular conference in South Africa. We do know the remarks that were made by former President Nelson Mandela, where he said South Africa's freedom is incomplete as long as Palestinians are still occupied by the state of Israel.
And as you say, in terms of our own foreign policy, it's very much a priority for South Africa. But we mentioned that this particular meeting has involved 24 other African states. Is there is there sort of a gradient level of these 25 that the Palestinian state feels there are those who are still very much at the top in their fight for self-determination for Palestine, and those who are truly slacking?
Well, so obviously it is quite a big challenge for the continent, just to speak on one voice. But the argument that has been used by the Palestinian is a very ugly past of Africa where, oppression was a massive issue in this continent, where even today, the continent is still coming to terms with some harsh realities. So they're banking on that historical issue that this is a continent really that should be at the forefront in terms of making sure that they do get support. There should be concerted efforts with the United Nations General Assembly coming up to try and refocus so that also they come up with a strategy that is going to resonate with quite a number of the member states on the continent. But also just apart from that, they do feel that there must be a targeted, a coordinated approach in terms of how they're engaging with the continent so that they really understand the gravity of the situation, especially because, recently we saw the US president going to West Bank and meeting with President Abbas. Nothing really much came. So they're really trying now to get support from other parts of the world so that, the whole understanding of their predicament can be better understood, especially because, Sabisa, what is very important at this particular point in time, the international community has been pushing the two-state solution. So with the annexation that continues unabated, for them, they say this is an opportunity to try and refocus the world to our situation.
All right, so Khayelihle, was there a strict agenda that was set out by Palestine on what its expectations are of AU members? And perhaps also just walk us back on that decision by the AU Commission Chair to grant Israel observer status. I know there was a huge fallout, but what happened thereafter and how did that decision come about?
And it's quite interesting, Zabisa, because, when I spoke to Minister Pandor, she said it was inexplicable how the AU Commission chair, Mustafa Mohammed, reached that particular conclusion. But from the side of the AU Commission chair, Mr. Mohammed, he said purely because, I mean, so many countries in the continent are doing the business with Israel in terms of technology, education, and many other spheres as well. And you'd recall, I think around 2018, there was that Africa-Israeli summits that was supposed to happen in Togo, but subsequently that engagement was cancelled because of the unrest the country was facing, but others were saying because of the pressure that the country was facing. So that was the main motivation that Mr. Mohammed used. But also, he said, look, he was trying to make sure that AU is a strong player in terms of the international politics, but not as far as South Africa, Algeria. Those are some of the most vociferous countries, and at least some of the countries here in the Southern Africa who denounced to all intents and purposes that particular decision by the AU Commission chair.
All right. So we know that our Minister of International Relations and Cooperation has called for all foreign affairs ministers to pay homage and actually in some sort of a symbolic way pay respect to the Palestinian American journalist who was recently killed. But why this particular individual, and not to say that it didn't create headlines or a stir, but it was part of a bigger problem, as Palestinians have said, that Palestinian journalists have been killed while trying to cover the Middle East conflict.
Well, absolutely, SABC. It is quite a very big concern for a number of media practitioners. But from the very perspective of Minister Pandor, she said this is going to be a massive campaign that they'll be embarking upon, especially as we know that we're edging close to the United Nations General Assembly in September, where really a clarion call will be on the women foreign affairs ministers in Europe, in Africa, to make sure that there is an impartial, independent investigation in light, of course, of that very terrible killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. And we know that, I mean, for example, already we have seen the US got involved, where they said it was so hard to determine really whether was it really from the terrorist or the so-called terrorist, or was it really from the Israeli forces. So it's quite a very interesting how the ministers brought this to the fore. But also just apart from that, I think it's quite important because, you know, she says it's part of supporting the media freedom, but also because of the very diplomatic and the historical ties that South Africa has always attached to the Palestinian cause, especially because, I mean, you look at so many reports that have been compiled by the likes of Amnesty International, your UN Human Rights Council, that have really raised concerns about the continued occupation of the Palestinian territories by the state of Israel. But of course, some of the backlash here at home that it's not putting South Africa in a good position from some of the, you know, lobby groups that are sympathizing with the state of Israel. They do say that South Africa ought to be, you know, just be able to engage with the two parties, Israelis and the Palestinians.
All right, thanks for that, Khayelihle Khumalo, my colleague on that summit by Palestinians. A great push for Africa to reconnect with the self-determination of the Palestinian state.